Good evening. This is the Forbidden Dispensary, and tonight we are not offering comfort. We are offering lineage, a long mud-stained family tree of a disease that has always loved small entrances. A thorn, a nail, a splinter tucked under the skin like a secret. Forget the clean hospital lighting you see in pamphlets. Forget the bright slogans that promise safety with a smile. The real story of tetanus lives in places where hands are dirty, where tools are shared, where wounds are shrugged off because the day still has work left in it. In the world before vaccines, before protocols, before people learned to fear the invisible with discipline instead of superstition, one careless puncture could buy you a slow war inside your own muscles. And yes, sometimes survival was medicine. Often it was luck. The kind of luck that has no ethics and no memory. So dim the room, silence whatever keeps trying to drag you back into your regular life. Let the old shadow open its mouth. The earliest descriptions arrive on brittle pages, written by physicians who were also somehow poets. They did not have microscopes. They did not have lab reports. But they had eyes, and they had time, and they had a kind of clinical cruelty. The willingness to watch a body betray itself and record the betrayal in detail. In Greco-Roman libraries, the symptoms appear like knife marks, short, sharp, undeniable. A jaw sealed like a clamp, a neck that will not bend, limbs that lock as if pulled tight by rope, a face twisted into a grin that doesn't belong to joy. They had names for what they could see. They called the locked jaw trismus, and they spoke of rigid bodies pulled backward into a terrible arch. They did not name the cause. How could they? So they named the act. They named the doing. They named the violence the disease performed on the person. Later generations would call that expression the sardonic smile, but the ancients already knew the look. They had seen it enough times to fear it and to write it down. Pliny the Elder, always collecting the world like a man afraid it would disappear, offered an image that stuck like a splinter. A plant from Sardinia, he said, something that could make a man laugh himself into death. A grin that was not comedy but sentence. That little story traveled forward through centuries like a whisper, and it gave later doctors a phrase that felt neat and awful. Risus sardonicus, a smile that mocks the living while the body is dying. Celsus and Galen offered more clinical attention. They noticed that some convulsions were different from epilepsy. The person might remain awake, trapped inside a body that had decided to harden and rebel. They observed wounds that looked unimpressive until the stiffness arrived, creeping upward, turning a small injury into a full-body catastrophe. Aretaeus of Cappadocia, writing in the early centuries of the Common Era, gave a portrait so careful that it still reads like a warning label. The progression from local stiffness to total tension. The strange mercy that the mind often stays clear. The horror of being present for your own undoing. These writers worked with what they had: humors, gods, moral explanations. They blamed black bile, they blamed divine anger. They blamed poison carried by thorn or spear. But beneath the theories, the observations were steady. The body did what it did. The jaw locked, the back arched, the muscles turned into a prison. And this was not only a Mediterranean nightmare. Far away in South and East Asia, physician scholars were cataloguing the same misery in their own language, with their own framework, their own herbs and cautery irons and prayers. The old Indian surgical and medical compilations, texts built over centuries, speak of wounds that rot, of spasms that follow injuries, of convulsive afflictions that later readers would recognize with a chill. They prescribed cleansing, careful cutting, heat, and a library of botanical antidotes aimed at what they called poison or disturbed balance. Different vocabulary, same fear. How to stop a simple wound from turning the body into stone. In China, the classics did not classify disease the way Western charts do, but they noticed the same pattern: a mouth that will not open, tight sinews, spasms climbing up from the limbs. They explained it with wind, cold, blocked flow. They treated with needles, heat, and bitter decoctions, meant to move what was stuck and warm what had been invaded. Procedure and observation, different costume, same stage. Later, Li Shizhen, compiling his vast Ming-era materia medica, gathered remedies and anecdotes like bones collected from an old battlefield. In doing so, he preserved the earlier observations, keeping them available to later healers who would recognize the same Lockjaw under new names. Across cultures, two themes repeat with ritual insistence. First, the symptom complex is unmistakable. The jaw like a vice, the rigid body, the backward arch, the strange smile that isn't humor. Second, the explanation begins as moral as often as physical. Punishment, poison, a disturbance of the fundamental forces that keep a human upright and moving. These were not silly metaphors. They were the best tools available to people whose instruments were hands and words, whose supply chains were baskets and jars. They treated with ointments, poultices, bandages, and sometimes with theater, chants, relics, exorcisms, because a convulsion could be read as disease or possession depending on who was standing at the bedside, and often both kinds of care happened in the same room. A soldier's thigh wound might be probed for foreign matter and packed with honey and spice to slow rot. In the next bed, a priest might murmur prayers over a man whose back was arching like a bow, because the body's violence looked like something unholy had moved in. Honey, wine, vinegar, soaked cloth pressed to wounds, trial and error antisepsis long before anyone used that word. When tissue turned foul, heat came next, a red-hot iron, cautery used as both weapon and prayer, burning away what looked corrupt, in hopes the corruption would stop there. The logic was simple and strategic. If you could contain the local injury, maybe you could prevent the body-wide collapse. Maybe you could keep the stiffness from climbing. Maybe you could keep the jaw from sealing shut. Then the medieval world thickened the story. Europe built monasteries and hospitals that became storehouses of both knowledge and habit. Places where care was structured not only by skill, but by faith, hierarchy, and ritual. Cleanliness of dressings mattered, even without germ theory. The school of Salerno compiled surgical sayings that emphasized prompt, organized care. Infection, whatever name it wore, could be limited by consistent attention, but theology shaped meaning. Saints were petitioned, relics were pressed to sweating foreheads. A convulsion could still be interpreted as spiritual invasion. A woman dying after childbirth might be seen as judgment rather than contamination. Still, practical measures persisted. They always do. Avicenna and Al-Razi, writing in the Islamic medical tradition, blended Greek learning with their own careful observation. They recommended cleaning wounds with wine, applying resinous preparations, cauterizing persistent infection. They argued for systems, lists of symptoms, rules for care, training for apprentices. Order, not just inspiration. In villages, domestic medicine filled the gaps. A blade rinsed in salt water. Butter or honey pressed into a cut. Work reduced if the family could afford it. In cities, guilds determined who had the right to cut and burn and bind. In London, barber surgeons formalized their roles: hair, bloodletting, bone setting, cautery, under municipal authority. The right to touch an infected limb became regulated power. And alongside all that, the parallel pharmacy never went away. Amulets, charms, whispered lines learned from older women who had buried too many babies. A newborn who would not feed because the jaw stayed tight might receive both prayer and herbal paste. If neither worked, it wasn't proof of foolishness. It was proof of scarcity. There were not enough effective tools yet. Records, when they exist, tell their own quiet story. Parish registers and municipal rolls sometimes note clusters of jaw-locking deaths after sieges and plagues, after harvest seasons when births happened fast and dirty at home, after battles when wounded bodies lay in fields long enough for soil to become fate. These are not dramatic narratives, they are blunt entries in ink, but they are data. And later, those scraps would become pattern. Surgery in the late medieval and early Renaissance period became bolder and more organized. Texts described not only treatments, but the logistics of running a practice in a city governed by guild rules and church authority. Wounds were closed with more intention. Dead tissue was recognized as dangerous, even if no one could name the organism that loved it. When outbreaks of post-injury stiffness followed famine or warfare, municipal councils sometimes responded not with prayer alone, but with organization. More supplies, better oversight, tighter control of midwives, more trained attendants. These were early public health moves before public health had a name. Then Europe stepped into the early modern era, and a new habit took root: classification. Observation recorded not for wonder, but for comparison. Symptoms became categories, categories became strategy. Physicians urged each other to pay attention to how diseases behaved across seasons and cities. Words sharpened, old Greek terms returned with new precision: trismus for the jaw, tetanus for the tension that stretched the body like a cruel instrument. Hospitals in Paris, London, and Vienna became laboratories of the bedside. Autopsy became more accepted, and comparison became more ruthless. What looked different in the wound of a man who became rigid versus the wound of a man who healed? The story was slowly turning, not into triumph, not yet, into a question. Could this terror, this locked mouth, this backward arch, this grin that looked like mockery, be caused by something reproducible, something small, something that could be stopped? And that is where we will go next, deeper into the long corridor, toward the late-century lamps and the benches stained with the slow poetry of experiments. Keep your voice low. The story is beginning to smell like broth, phenol, damp fur, and old ambition. By the late 19th century, Europe had become a continent of laboratories the way earlier centuries had been a continent of monasteries. The new priests wore aprons, not vestments. Their relics were slides and stains. Their faith was repetition. In those rooms, the microscope became a confessional. It did not forgive. It only revealed. Sometimes, Paris had Pasteur's orbit, bright with fermentation and invisible life. Berlin had Koch's discipline, where proof was treated like law. And moving through that German laboratory world, sometimes as guest, sometimes as shadow, was a Japanese bacteriologist whose hands were steady enough to make history feel inevitable. But first, a smaller name and a colder year. In Germany, in the year 1884, Arthur Nicolaier reported what he saw in the wounds of tetanus victims: slender rods, spores at the end like a match head. He found similar forms in soil. His notes were careful and unpleasantly calm. He suspected an organism that preferred airless spaces, something that tolerated heat and mocked oxygen. The creature's patience showed in the way it could wait as a spore, inert and durable, until a wound offered it the kind of darkness it liked. Nicolaier's work was a pointing finger, not a full arrest. He had not yet done what the new bacteriology demanded: isolate it cleanly, grow it, reproduce the disease with it, and show the mechanism was not superstition, but chemistry. Still, he had put the culprit in the frame. The decisive work came later, in the year 1889, inside the buzzing order of Koch's laboratory. Shibasaburo Kitasato, recently arrived working in that tight German climate of rivalry and precision, managed what had been maddeningly difficult. He isolated the anaerobic bacillus from clinical material. He cultivated it in conditions where oxygen could not interfere. He grew it in the kind of sealed, disciplined darkness that the organism required. Then he did something that changed the story's genre. He filtered the cultures until no bacteria remained, sterile filtrate, clear of living cells, and injected that filtrate into animals: rabbits, guinea pigs, creatures small enough to become evidence. The animals developed the signs, the rigidity, the spasms, the diagnostic cruelty that physicians had described for centuries. The conclusion was sharp enough to cut. The disease was not merely the physical spread of bacteria into the brain. It was a poison, a toxin. Something diffusible, something that could travel, something that could turn a wound into a distant catastrophe. That single demonstration rearranged clinical imagination. If tetanus was driven by a soluble poison, then the battle was not only in the wound, the battle was also in the blood, in the interval between toxin release and nerve capture. There was a window, a brief precious moment when the poison was still floating free, still reachable. The question became obvious, almost greedy. Could you neutralize the toxin before it reached its target? Kitasato and his contemporaries had an answer that felt like theft from the future. Animals immunized against the toxin developed serum that could neutralize it. Serum from one creature could protect another. The idea had appeared in other contexts. Diphtheria was already teaching the same lesson, but tetanus made it urgent because the disease was so merciless and, once established, so hard to reverse. It was the birth of passive immunity as a practical tool, antibodies as a transferable shield. In that ferment of ideas, Emil von Behring moved as both scientist and strategist. He understood that knowledge was not enough. A therapy had to be measured, standardized, bottled, shipped. Paul Ehrlich supplied the conceptual language that helped make antibodies feel quantifiable, not mystical. Binding, specificity, titers. He helped turn serum that seems to work into serum with potency we can count. And the practical consequence, the thing nobody romanticizes but everything depends on, was this. Large animals became factories. Horses most often. Their bodies were big enough to yield volumes of serum. Their temperaments were workable. Their blood could be drawn and drawn again. The procedure was strangely intimate. A regimen of increasing exposures to inactivated toxin. The horse's immune system taught, pressured, trained. Then blood drawn from the jugular under practiced hands. Serum separated, processed, bottled. Stables became annexes of the laboratory. The image is almost domestic. A horse standing quietly, steam in its breath, while technicians move with needles and glass. But the scale was industrial, and the stakes were national. Because once antitoxin existed, the world demanded it everywhere at once. Hospitals wanted it. Cities wanted it. Armies wanted it most of all. Military medicine, always hungry for anything that reduces death without slowing operations, treated tetanus antitoxin as a supply item, like bandages and morphine. A wounded soldier in a muddy field hospital became a logistics problem. Debride the wound, dress it, and inject antitoxin while time still allowed. The while time still allowed is the point that shaped everything. Laboratory work had shown that antitoxin could neutralize toxin only while it was still unbound, circulating, extracellular, not yet locked inside nerves. Once the toxin had entered nerve terminals and begun its inward journey, serum could not pull it back. Antibodies do not reach inside neurons like a locksmith. They are bouncers at the door, not assassins in the hallway. That mechanistic detail explained a clinical paradox surgeons had long muttered about. One man with a deep, filthy wound might never develop tetanus, while another with a shallow puncture would die. The difference could be timing, microenvironment, oxygen levels, how quickly toxin entered nerves, how fast the body's defenses, if any, could mop up what was released. So medicine learned a harsh rhythm. Do not wait. Better to give antitoxin and accept its risks than to hesitate and watch the jaw seal. Those risks were real, and they matter in this story because the history of prevention is never purely triumphant. It is always a bargain. Horse serum is foreign protein. Human bodies sometimes reacted badly. Fever, rash, joint pain. The delayed misery called serum sickness. In some cases, severe allergy. In rare cases, sudden collapse. Clinicians made a cold calculation. Untreated tetanus killed with brutal efficiency. Serum sickness made you miserable, sometimes dangerous, but often survivable. In the arithmetic of war and emergency medicine, the choice was obvious. The need to standardize and distribute antitoxin exposed a truth that public health keeps rediscovering. Science does not matter until supply chains exist. To protect populations required horses, stable workers, veterinarians, technicians, sterilization systems, cold rooms, syringes, and transportation networks that could carry fragile glass bottles from urban laboratories to village clinics and frontline dressing stations. The therapy was born on a bench, but it lived or died by trains, ice, and discipline. And still, even as antitoxin spread, a deeper hunger grew inside the laboratory world. Antitoxin was a shield borrowed from another body, temporary, reactive, dependent on timing and availability. What if you could teach the human body to make its own protection in advance? That thought was the hinge between emergency prophylaxis and true prevention, between medicine that chases disasters and medicine that starves them before they arrive. But before we move into vaccines, we have to follow the toxin itself. Because once the organism had a name and serum offered a partial defense, investigators turned inward. They wanted mechanism. They wanted to know how a wound in a foot could end in a rigid jaw, how a bacterium in dead tissue could reach into the nervous system without ever marching there in a visible invasion. The toxin received its name, tetanospasmin, the spasm-bringing poison, and it turned out to be a molecular machine with a cruel elegance. Structurally, it is a two-chain protein, heavy chain and light chain, linked by a disulfide bond. The heavy chain is the key, the light chain is the blade. The heavy chain binds to specific molecules on nerve terminals, gangliosides among them, and mediates uptake. The toxin is taken into vesicles, swallowed by the neuron itself. When that vesicle acidifies, the heavy chain forms a pore, a passageway, and the light chain slips through, free to do its work. Inside the neuron, the light chain acts as a protease with very particular taste. It cleaves synaptobrevin, also known as vesicle-associated membrane protein, a component of the machinery that allows neurotransmitters to be released. No release, no message. But tetanus does not primarily silence the neurons that make muscles contract. That would create weakness. That would be a different horror. Tetanus targets inhibitory interneurons, the cells that normally release glycine and gamma-aminobutyric acid, the chemical brakes of the nervous system. It cuts the wires that say stop. So excitation remains unopposed, muscles contract, and they do not let go. The toxin travels retrograde along axons toward the spinal cord and brainstem, riding the internal tracks of the nerve cell like a thief on a night train. By the time it reaches central circuits, the body's reflexes are unrestrained. That is why sound can trigger spasm, touch, light. A footstep in the hallway. The nervous system becomes a loaded trap. The comparison to botulism, its cousin in the same family of clostridial toxins, is instructive and bleak. Botulinum toxins act at the neuromuscular junction and produce flaccid paralysis. They cut the accelerator. Tetanus cuts the brakes. Both are precise, both are elegant, both are merciless. And the permanence of the cut is another reason this disease terrorized pre-modern wards. Once the toxin has cleaved the target proteins, the neuron has to rebuild. New proteins synthesized, new terminals formed. Recovery, when it comes, is slow, not measured in days but in weeks and months. This, too, clarified the limits of antitoxin. Antibodies can neutralize toxin in the bloodstream, in tissue spaces, in the open. But once the toxin is inside the neuron, the antibody is irrelevant. You cannot mop up what has already been swallowed. Prevention, not heroics, saves the spine. So now the history tightens. The old clinical signs, trismus, the sardonic grin, the backward arch, are suddenly linked to a molecular story that explains why timing matters, why some wounds kill and others do not, why survival is slow even in the best care. And it sets the stage for the next shift, from borrowed immunity to built immunity, from stables of horses to vials of toxoid, from emergency response to routine protection. That is where we go next. The Forbidden Dispensary. Keep listening. We are leaving the stable yard and stepping into something colder. Policy, routine, the kind of prevention that looks boring right up until you remember what it replaced. Antitoxin was a rescue rope, and sometimes it held. Sometimes it snapped. Sometimes it arrived too late. It depended on timing, refrigeration, trained hands, and a decision made before the toxin boarded the nerves. It also depended on horses. There is no clean romance in that dependence. A nation's hope bottled in glass, drawn from an animal's neck, shipped on ice, administered with urgency, and carrying with it the risk of serum sickness, the risk of allergy, the price of borrowing immunity from another species. By the early 20th century, medicine wanted something else. Not borrowed protection, but owned protection. Not a temporary shield, but memory. And the answer came from an idea so simple it feels like it should have been obvious earlier, except that nothing is obvious until someone proves it, measures it, manufactures it, and convinces the world to accept it. If tetanus was driven by toxin, then stop fighting the bacterium like it was the whole story. Fight the toxin. Teach the immune system to recognize it before the wound ever happens. The trick was this: the toxin is lethal in microscopic amounts. You cannot vaccinate with it raw and call it courage. You need to tame it, render it harmless while keeping its shape recognizable to the immune system. In the decade of the 1920s, Gaston Ramon at the Pasteur Institute refined that taming. He treated tetanus toxin with formaldehyde, turning it into a toxoid. No longer poisonous, still antigenic. The immune system could see it, learn it, remember it, without being destroyed by it. A poison turned into a lesson. That is the moment the story bends away from desperate bedside improvisation and toward something colder and more powerful: population-level prevention. But even a toxoid is not automatically a good vaccine. The immune system is not always impressed by what you offer it. Sometimes it needs persuasion, a nudge, a signal that says, "This matters, do not ignore it." That nudge arrived in the form of adjuvants. Alexander Glennie and others found that aluminum salts could amplify immune response, turning a weak lecture into something the body would study seriously. The result was a stronger, longer-lasting antibody production, more durable protection, fewer people slipping through. Now the science had a tool that could scale, and once you have a scalable tool, you need a machine to deliver it. Armies were the first to build that machine at full force, because armies love anything that turns death into logistics, and logistics into routine. In the First World War, antitoxin had been used relentlessly, but it was still reactive, still a race. In the Second World War, toxoid immunization became policy. Recruits received injections as part of training, not because generals suddenly became sentimental, but because the math was unignorable. Fewer cases, fewer deaths, fewer men lost to an enemy that did not wear a uniform. The shift between those wars is one of the quiet revolutions of medicine. Wounds did not become cleaner, soil did not become less contaminated, war did not become kinder. The difference was immune memory. It is worth lingering here because this is where prevention stops being an idea and becomes infrastructure. Vaccination programs require a kind of social choreography that earlier medicine rarely demanded. Multiple doses, records, storage, distribution, trained staff, follow-up, in other words, bureaucracy. After the wars, civilian life inherited what military medicine had learned. Public health officials who had watched vaccination protect soldiers argued for broader programs. They brought their data and their bruised certainty to ministries, to legislatures, to city councils. The logic was framed in budgets and national strength, as often as it was framed in compassion. Prevention is cheaper, prevention preserves labor, prevention reduces hospital burden. Prevention makes a nation look competent. So the toxoid moved into civilian schedules. It rarely traveled alone. As the mid-century world loved combination, assembly lines, combined arms, combined vaccines, tetanus toxoid was paired with diphtheria toxoid, and later with pertussis components. The injection became routine childhood medicine in many places. A small needle in an upper arm, barely remembered by the child, yet changing the probability landscape of an entire population. This is the kind of victory that does not produce a statue. It produces silence. Hospitals that had once seen Lockjaw cases as a familiar terror began to see them as rare, not gone, never gone, because the organism lives in soil and does not need humans to survive, but pushed back, starved of victims. And this is where the story splits into two maps. On one map, the modern health system hums. There are refrigerators that work, nurses who have training, supply chains that arrive on time, records that exist, clinics that are reachable. In those places, tetanus becomes mostly a disease of neglect. People who never finished childhood vaccination, adults who never received boosters, the elderly whose immunity has faded. On the other map, tetanus continues as an old punishment for poverty. Not mystical punishment, structural punishment. Places where births happen far from clinics, where clean blades are scarce, where cord care follows tradition because tradition is what exists when systems do not. Neonatal tetanus is the sharpest example. The newborn is a perfect victim, the immune system immature, the umbilical stump raw and vulnerable, the environment often unsterile. If the mother lacks protective antibodies, the infant has little defense. And in many communities, for generations, the cord was cut with whatever tool was available and treated with whatever substance was believed to help. Ash, butter, plant paste, sometimes animal dung. Not because people were cruel, but because people were doing what their mothers taught them in places where modern supplies did not arrive. By the late 20th century, global health organizations treated neonatal tetanus not merely as a tragedy, but as a signal, a marker of where systems were failing women and infants. In the year 1989, the World Health Organization, alongside partners, launched a coordinated effort aimed at eliminating maternal and neonatal tetanus as a public health problem. The strategy was blunt and effective when implemented well. 1. Immunize women of reproductive age so their antibodies protect their newborns. 2. Promote clean birth practices and clean cord care. On paper, it reads like a simple list. In real life, it is a war with geography, trust, electricity, roads, and politics. Vaccination campaigns require cold chain, vials kept at safe temperature from factory to village. They require transport that can survive mud and distance. They require workers who can reach women in homes where male outsiders may not be welcome. They require records that do not vanish when a family moves or a clinic burns or a flood takes the roof away. They also require persuasion, not the cheap persuasion of threat, but the slow persuasion of relationship. Community health workers, local leaders, traditional birth attendants brought in, rather than pushed aside, women taught that a clean blade and dry cord are not an insult to heritage. Where that work was done, patiently, repeatedly, neonatal tetanus rates collapsed. The newborn clenched jaw became less common. Entire districts shifted from routine grief to something closer to expectation of survival. But where conflict or collapse broke systems, tetanus waited. It always waits. The organism does not need you. It does not chase you. It sits in soil as a spore, durable and indifferent, until a wound offers it a pocket of low oxygen and dead tissue. It does not care whether the wound is from a battlefield fragment or a home birth cord stump. It only cares that the environment is right. Now, before we go further, we need to speak about the modern clinical reality. Not the myth, not the metaphor, but what a case looks like when it walks into a hospital, and why some hospitals can save the patient while others can only watch. Because even now, after toxoid, after protocols, after decades of vaccines, tetanus still appears, and when it does, it demands resources. The diagnosis remains mostly clinical. Tests exist, but in many settings they are irrelevant or unavailable. The physician sees trismus, spasms triggered by touch or sound, the grim smile, the rigid back. In infants, refusal to feed, stiffness, convulsions. And the first move is always the same: neutralize what can still be neutralized. Human tetanus immune globulin, when available, binds circulating toxin that has not yet entered nerves. It is safer than horse serum and has become standard in wealthier systems. But it still depends on supply, refrigeration, cost, distribution. Second move, remove the source. Wound care is not cosmetic here. It is survival, debridement, irrigation, removal of necrotic tissue. No cozy language. The goal is to eliminate the anaerobic pocket where the organism thrives. Third move, suppress the body's runaway reflexes. Sedatives, muscle relaxants, and often mechanical ventilation. Because severe tetanus can lock the chest wall and turn breathing into a battle the patient cannot win without support. This is where the map splits again. In an intensive care unit with ventilators, trained staff, and medications, a severe tetanus patient can be sedated, intubated, supported through weeks of danger, and eventually recover as neurons rebuild their machinery. In a clinic without those resources, the same disease is often fatal. That is the ugly truth behind the global decline. Tetanus is not only a biological event, it is a measure of infrastructure. And infrastructure, as you already know, is never distributed evenly. This chapter smells like iron, sweat, and old sawdust. There was a time when an operating theatre was exactly what the name suggests. A performance space. A room lit by gas, crowded with observers, loud with opinions. Surgeons moved fast because speed was a virtue and pain was a clock. Instruments were reused until they dulled. Hands moved from corpse to childbirth to open wound with nothing but a rinse that would insult a modern sink. Nobody called it negligence. They called it normal, and in that normal, tetanus found its invitations. A puncture wound in the field was one thing. A surgical cut made in a hospital, an institution that promised healing, was something darker. A wound created by authority, then left vulnerable to spores that did not care who held the scalpel. Post-operative tetanus was a familiar terror, not always counted cleanly, but recognized in the way people recognize a storm front. A patient recovering, then the jaw stiffens, the neck tightens, the face pulls into that wrong grin, the spasms begin, provoked by footsteps, by a dropped tray, by a whisper. A hospital that produced such deaths did not always blame its own habits. It blamed fate. It blamed the patient's constitution. It blamed the air. But there were voices who looked at the pattern and refused to accept mystery as an excuse. In Vienna, in the year 1847, Ignaz Semmelweis walked between two maternity wards and kept a ledger like a man trying to catch a killer with arithmetic. In one ward, staffed by doctors and medical students who moved from autopsies to deliveries, women died of puerperal fever at a grimly higher rate. In the other ward, staffed by midwives, the deaths were lower. Semmelweis made a suggestion so plain it sounded like insult. Wash the hands, not rinse, not gesture. Wash, using chlorinated lime after leaving the dissecting room. The death rate fell with a sharpness that should have ended the argument. It did not. They mocked him. They resisted the implication that their hands carried death. They exiled him socially and professionally. He died in the year 1865, a bitter figure whose insight was correct, but whose era did not yet have the cultural nerves to tolerate it. His story matters here because tetanus is not only a bacterium in soil, it is also an indictment of systems. A disease thrives where procedures are sloppy, where arrogance is routine, where cleanliness is treated as optional theatre rather than enforced practice. The louder change, more widely accepted, more easily packaged, came with Joseph Lister. Lister read Pasteur's work on fermentation and grasped the implication that the air and surfaces carried living agents capable of ruining tissue the way they ruined wine. In the year 1867, he published what amounted to a manifesto, Antiseptic Surgery. He used carbolic acid, phenol, ugly, stinging, sharp-smelling, and applied it to dressings, instruments, wounds, and even the air itself via spray. The carbolic fog became a kind of ritual, and it worked often enough to change the conversation. Wounds that would have suppurated healed cleaner. Compound fractures, once a near guarantee of infection and death, sometimes survived. Gangrene retreated in some wards. The old certainty that infection was inevitable began to crack. But antisepsis was only a phase, and an imperfect one. It depended on heroic chemical intervention after contamination had already occurred. It could irritate tissues. It could be applied inconsistently. It could become performative rather than disciplined. So surgery evolved again, away from killing microbes with chemicals toward preventing microbes from entering the field at all. Asepsis. This shift was not just scientific, it was architectural and behavioral. It required new rooms, new workflows, new habits, and new humility. Steam sterilization became standard for instruments. Autoclaves turned heat and pressure into routine. The operating room began to resemble a controlled environment rather than a crowded amphitheater. Gloves entered the scene in a way that was almost accidental and therefore very human. At Johns Hopkins in the year 1889, William Halsted ordered rubber gloves for an assistant whose hands were suffering from chemical dermatitis. Comfort was the initial excuse. Protection was the consequence. Once surgeons saw that gloved hands reduced contamination, gloves became a barrier not only against irritation, but against death. Masks followed, gowns, separate sterile trays, scrub rooms, a choreography designed to keep human skin and breath from becoming part of the incision. The sensory world changed. The sharp stench of carbolic became less dominant in many places. Linen and soap replaced chemical fog. The surgeon's pride shifted from bare-handed speed to controlled precision. And here is where tetanus prevention gained a practical edge that goes beyond the romance of sterilized steel. Clostridium tetani does not thrive in oxygen. It thrives in darkness, deep, devitalized tissue, pockets where blood supply is poor, places where air cannot easily reach. The organism's spores can be everywhere, but disease happens when the wound offers an anaerobic niche. So surgeons learned, sometimes the hard way, that cleaning the surface was not enough. They needed to reshape the wound environment. Debridement became doctrine, not cosmetic trimming, but ruthless removal of devitalized tissue and foreign material. Irrigation, re-exploration when necessary, leaving certain wounds open instead of sealing in a pocket of darkness. This was not gentle work. It meant sacrificing tissue to save life. It meant accepting uglier scars to prevent worse outcomes. War, as always, forced these lessons into sharp relief. Deep contaminated wounds, shell fragments, boot leather driven into muscle, dirt packed into lacerations, were ideal environments for tetanus and for gas gangrene. Surgeons in military hospitals began to treat such injuries with a new logic. Widen, excise, drain, oxygenate. Speed still mattered, but it became speed in service of cleanliness rather than speed as performance. Meanwhile, antitoxin sat on its own track, racing alongside surgical reform. In the year 1890, Behring and Kitasato had demonstrated that serum could transfer protection against diphtheria and tetanus. That discovery translated into clinical practice with the force of need. In battlefield medicine and in hospitals dealing with dirty injuries, equine antitoxin became a standard intervention. Again, powerful, imperfect, expensive in its own way. It saved lives when given early. It failed when given late. It caused serum sickness and allergic reactions in some recipients. It demanded production infrastructure, horses, technicians, potency testing, distribution. And that tension between life-saving benefit and collateral harm pushed medicine toward a cleaner passive immunity. Human tetanus immune globulin arrived later, enabled by the rise of blood banking and plasma fractionation techniques in the mid-20th century. Human-derived antibodies reduced the risk of severe reactions seen with equine serum, though they introduced their own demands: donors, screening, storage, and cold chain reliability. But even human globulin remained a response tool. It was prophylaxis after exposure, or early treatment when disease threatened. The more radical victory was still the toxoid. By the time mass immunization became normalized, surgery and vaccination began to reinforce each other. Sterile technique reduced contamination. Debridement reduced anaerobic niches. Vaccination ensured that even if toxin was produced, the body could neutralize it before it reached nerves. It was layered defense, systems stacked on systems. And this is the point where the history stops being purely medical and becomes frankly political. Because the decline of post-operative tetanus in wealthy settings did not happen merely because doctors became smarter. It happened because hospitals could afford autoclaves, could enforce protocols, could train staff, could maintain supply chains. It happened because institutions changed, because regulations tightened, because the cost of building cleanliness became acceptable. In places where resources remained thin, the old risks persisted. A clinic without reliable electricity cannot run an autoclave consistently. A hospital without adequate staffing cannot enforce sterile choreography. A supply chain with frequent stockouts cannot guarantee vaccine boosters or immune globulin. A facility without good waste disposal turns cleanliness into aspiration rather than routine. Tetanus is ruthless in its fairness. It punishes gaps, not intentions. So now we have built the scaffold for the next chapter. We have the bench discovery, the toxin, the antitoxin, the toxoid. We have the operating theatre learning discipline. Next comes the place where all of this collided at full scale, the battlefield and the maternity ward, two environments that turned prevention into policy and made logistics as important as diagnosis. The Forbidden Dispensary. This is where the story stops pretending medicine is only about science. This is where it admits what it has always been: supply, discipline, politics, and who gets reached in time. The battlefield has always been a school that charges tuition in bodies. Long before toxoid schedules and booster reminders, war taught clinicians how tetanus behaves when it has endless opportunity. War makes the perfect wound: deep, dirty, crushed tissue, foreign material driven into flesh, a pocket of darkness where oxygen cannot follow. You do not need a philosopher to understand why Clostridia thrive there. You only need mud. In the wars of the 19th century, surgeons saw Lockjaw as a kind of delayed sentence. A man could survive the bullet, survive the amputation, survive the fever, and then, days later, the jaw would begin to tighten as if a new enemy had arrived after the ceasefire. The old records describe it with exhausted dread, a soldier recovering, then stiffening, then arching. Those accounts helped shift tetanus from superstition into pattern. In military medicine, pattern is everything. Armies cannot manage what they cannot count, so they began to count. By the time antitoxin existed, the counting turned into policy debates. Who should receive prophylactic serum? How much? How fast? And at what cost? The question was never purely medical. It was logistical. Antitoxin was fragile, expensive, and finite. You could not give it to everyone forever. You had to decide where it would do the most good. And then came the First World War, and the debate became urgent enough to override hesitation. Trench warfare was a gift to anaerobes. Shells churned soil into slurry. Wounds were contaminated, not with clean dirt, but with a mixture of earth, fabric, rust, and fragments of whatever had been exploded nearby. Men lay in that mixture long enough for spores to find their way into tissue that was already dying from trauma and poor blood flow. Field hospitals behind the lines became triage factories. Surgeons debrided as best they could. Dressings were applied, antitoxin was injected where it was available and where the wound was deemed dangerous enough to justify the vial. In military medical journals, in regimental returns, in quiet letters written by medics who could not sleep, you see the same refrain: timing, timing, timing. If antitoxin could be delivered early, cases fell. If it arrived late, it became ritual, comfort rather than rescue. And every success was bounded by transport. Antitoxin needed cold, it needed intact glass. It needed someone trained enough to use it without wasting it. It needed to be present at the right moment, in the right tent, while artillery still shook the ground. A therapy can be proven in a laboratory in a single afternoon. But delivering it to a battlefield is an argument with geography. The interwar years brought the more durable weapon: toxoid immunization. By the time the Second World War arrived, armies in several countries had turned tetanus vaccination into a requirement. Recruits were injected as part of the machinery of mobilization. not because generals loved needles, but because fewer tetanus deaths meant fewer replacements needed, fewer morale-breaking horrors in hospitals, fewer men lost after injuries that otherwise might have been survivable. The difference between the wars was stark enough that it could not be ignored. The same kinds of wounds occurred, the same soil existed, but the immune system of the average soldier had changed. It had been trained ahead of time. That is the quiet power of routine prevention. It makes catastrophe stop being common enough to feel inevitable. Yet war also reveals the limits of organization. Vaccination programs require records. War destroys records. Vaccination requires follow-up. War scatters people. Vaccination requires trust. War manufactures suspicion. So even in the era of toxoid, tetanus did not vanish. It retreated, then flared in the cracks, among those who missed doses, among civilians caught outside health systems, among the displaced, among the wounded whose care was delayed long enough for toxin to get ahead. And this brings us to the other arena where tetanus has always been cruel: childbirth. Neonatal tetanus is not a war story, but it carries the same signature: an entry point, contamination, an anaerobic niche, and a body too small to resist. The umbilical stump is a wound by definition. It is raw, vulnerable tissue, and it exists at the exact moment when the newborn has no immune memory of its own. The only protection the newborn has, at first, is what the mother gives: antibodies passed across the placenta in late pregnancy. If the mother has been immunized, the infant borrows her shield. If she has not, the infant enters the world naked. For centuries in many regions, births happened at home under conditions shaped by distance, cost, tradition, and gendered power. The cord was cut with whatever tool was available: a kitchen knife, a razor, a piece of sharpened metal, sometimes glass. The stump might be dressed with substances that carried meaning and hope: ash, butter, herbal paste, oils, powders. Some of these practices were benign, some were disastrous. Many were simply what existed when sterile kits did not. Clostridium tetani does not require elaborate ritual. It requires spores and an oxygen-poor pocket. A contaminated cord stump can provide both. Neonatal tetanus announces itself in a way that is heartbreakingly consistent. The baby feeds normally for a brief time, then stops. The jaw tightens. The body stiffens. Spasms appear, triggered by touch, noise, light. The infant arches, clenches, and struggles to breathe. Without intensive support, death is common. This is why public health began to treat neonatal tetanus as a marker of system failure. Not just a disease, but a signpost that says, women are not being reached, births are not clean, immunization coverage is incomplete, and surveillance is blind. In the year 1989, the World Health Organization and partners launched what became the Maternal and Neonatal Tetanus Elimination Initiative. The goal was not eradication. It cannot be eradicated because the organism lives in soil and does not need humans. The goal was elimination as a public health problem, driving incidence down to a low threshold in every district. The strategy had two pillars. First pillar, vaccinate women of reproductive age, especially pregnant women, with tetanus toxoid to ensure antibodies pass to newborns. Second pillar, promote clean delivery and cord care, clean hands, clean blade, clean surface, and leaving the stump dry and protected. On paper, it reads like the simplest medicine in the world. In practice, it demanded 1,000 small victories. Health workers had to reach women who might not attend prenatal clinics. Campaigns had to navigate cultural rules about who can enter a home, who can speak to who controls decisions about medical care. Refrigeration had to work in places where electricity was unreliable. Roads had to exist. Fuel had to exist. Paper records had to survive rain, insects, and political instability. And in the places where routine services were weak, the initiative relied on campaigns, supplementary immunization activities targeting women in high-risk districts. Teams moved village to village, carrying coolers, marking fingers, updating lists, returning for additional doses. The pattern of success was consistent. Where community engagement was respectful and persistent, vaccination coverage rose and neonatal tetanus fell. Where programs treated tradition as stupidity, resistance hardened. Where conflict made travel dangerous, coverage collapsed. Clean delivery practices also had to be made tangible. A lecture about cleanliness is not enough if there is no soap, no clean surface, no sterile blade. So programs distributed clean delivery kits, simple packets containing blade, cord tie, soap, sometimes antiseptic. Training traditional birth attendants mattered, not because they were perfect, but because they were present. Later, evidence supported the use of chlorhexidine for cord cleansing in high-risk settings, a practical antiseptic intervention that could reduce infection where sterile conditions were hard to guarantee. It was a small chemical change with a large epidemiological effect. This is how tetanus is defeated in the real world, not by a single invention, but by layering small, reliable practices until the organism has fewer chances. Even so, the last pockets were, and remain, the hardest. Conflict zones, remote districts, marginalized communities, places where deaths occur at home and are never recorded, where the true burden is guessed rather than counted. In those settings, elimination is not merely a technical goal, it is a political and ethical test. Will the system pursue the last vulnerable households, or will it settle for national averages that look good on paper? Because tetanus thrives in averages, it lives in the uncounted. Now we need to return to the bedside again to understand why modern intensive care changed outcomes so dramatically, and why those outcomes remain unequal. A severe tetanus patient needs a kind of care that is not glamorous but relentless. Sedation, airway protection, sometimes neuromuscular blockade, sometimes ventilation for weeks. Autonomic instability needs management. Nutrition needs support. Complications need prevention. The result is that in a well-equipped intensive care unit, tetanus can be survivable even when severe. In a low-resource setting, without ventilators, and without reliable immune globulin, tetanus can still kill with the same old efficiency. That inequality is the hinge between prevention and tragedy. It explains why global health emphasizes vaccination so fiercely. Prevention is cheaper than intensive care, and it is more equitable if done well. A vaccine dose delivered to a pregnant woman is a shield for 2 lives at once. This is the part clinicians speak about in low voices, because even now the disease has a way of making the room feel smaller. Modern medicine has machines, monitors, assays, and names for everything. Tetanus remains, stubbornly, a diagnosis you can often make with your eyes and your ears. In many places, no laboratory test arrives fast enough to matter, and even when it exists, it does not replace what the body announces. The warning sign is still ancient. The jaw begins to resist. The patient says chewing hurts, swallowing feels wrong. The mouth does not open the way it should. Trismus, the old word, still doing its job. Soon after comes the face, pulled tight, drawn into that grim expression clinicians still call risus sardonicus, the sardonic smile. It is not constant laughter, it is contraction, a mask made of muscle that can't relax. Then the body stiffens in wider territory, neck, trunk, limbs. The rigidity is not a brief twitch, it is tonic, sustained, painful. Spasms arrive like ambushes, provoked by sound, touch, bright light, a door closing, a nurse adjusting a sheet. It can feel like the nervous system has been wired to overreact to everything. In severe disease, the back arches into opisthotonos, a posture so dramatic it has lived in medical writing for centuries. The spine becomes an instrument under tension. The chest wall tightens. Breathing turns mechanical and fragile. And here is one of the crueler clinical details. Consciousness is often preserved. The patient can be awake, alert, aware, trapped inside the body's refusal to let go. That detail matters because it distinguishes tetanus from other convulsive illnesses in ways that guide action. Epilepsy often has altered awareness. Rabies carries a different pattern of agitation and phobic response. Many metabolic causes of spasm have different triggers and timelines. Tetanus has its own rhythm. The history often gives it away. A puncture wound, especially deep and narrow, like a nail through a boot, provides the classic anaerobic pocket, but it does not have to be dramatic. A splinter, a bite, a laceration contaminated with soil, a crush injury with devitalized tissue, a surgical wound cared for poorly. Sometimes there is no obvious wound at all, or it has already healed on the surface and been forgotten. The bacterium does not require an open crater. It requires a dark niche and time. The incubation period, the time between injury and symptoms, matters in a brutal, predictive way. Shorter incubation often means heavier toxin load and worse prognosis. Clinicians learn to take that timeline seriously. Days is ominous. Weeks can still be lethal, but days are the kind of schedule that forces urgency into every decision. There are forms beyond the classic generalized picture. Localized tetanus can produce rigidity near the wound without immediate spread. Cephalic tetanus, rare and severe, can follow head wounds or ear infections and involve cranial nerves. Neonatal tetanus remains its own tragedy, often emerging within the first days of life, with an infant who cannot feed and then begins to spasm. Now, how is it managed when it appears? Modern care is not one miracle drug, it is layered steps, each addressing a different part of the mechanism. First layer, neutralized toxin that is still reachable. Human tetanus immune globulin is given, when available, to bind circulating toxin that has not yet entered nerves. Timing matters. This is not a cure for toxin already inside neurons. It is a race to catch what is still free. There is also a practical detail that can sound counterintuitive. Even when tetanus is diagnosed, the patient still needs active vaccination. Tetanus disease does not reliably produce immunity because the amount of toxin required to cause illness is often too small to stimulate a protective antibody response. Survivors can get tetanus again. The body is not taught by suffering here, it is simply injured by it. Second layer, remove the source. Wound care becomes an emergency procedure, not an afterthought. Debridement to remove necrotic tissue, irrigation, removal of foreign material, re-exploration if needed. The goal is to eliminate the anaerobic pocket where Clostridia can keep producing toxin. Antibiotics are used to suppress the organism. Metronidazole is commonly favored for anaerobic coverage. Older regimens included penicillin, but practice shifted in many places due to side effect considerations and evolving evidence. Antibiotics do not neutralize toxin already produced, but they reduce further production and help clean the battlefield. Third layer, control the spasms and protect the airway. Sedation is not optional in severe cases. Benzodiazepines are a mainstay because they enhance inhibitory neurotransmission and reduce spasm intensity. In severe disease, sedation alone is not enough. Neuromuscular blockade may be required, and once paralysis is induced, the patient cannot breathe unassisted. Mechanical ventilation becomes the bridge that keeps the patient alive, while the toxin's effects slowly fade and nerve function rebuilds. This can take weeks. Fourth layer, manage autonomic instability. Severe tetanus is not only muscle rigidity. It can become an autonomic storm. Wild swings in blood pressure and heart rate, profuse sweating, fever, instability that can kill even when ventilation is available. Magnesium sulfate has been used as a valuable tool in many settings because it can reduce spasm severity and blunt autonomic surges. Other agents may be used depending on resources and protocols. Beta blockers, careful sedation strategies, supportive cardiovascular management, nutrition, fluids, electrolyte balance, prevention of complications, pneumonia, blood clots, pressure injuries, become part of the long, unglamorous work of keeping a body alive through prolonged critical illness. This is where the resource divide becomes a physical fact. In a well-equipped intensive care unit with ventilators, infusion pumps, trained staff, and reliable supplies, survival rates can be dramatically improved. The disease becomes survivable, though still brutal. In a district hospital without ventilators, without sufficient sedation options, without immune globulin, the same disease can be a death sentence. Clinicians can try to control spasms with what they have. They can keep the room quiet and dark to reduce triggers. They can administer antibiotics and attempt wound care. But they cannot replace breathing when the chest wall becomes rigid and the airway fails. Tetanus is one of those illnesses that exposes the skeleton of a health system. The patient's outcome becomes an X-ray of infrastructure, cold chain, supply procurement, training, staffing ratios, and referral capacity. And then there is the matter of prevention after injury, which is where modern emergency medicine has become a kind of ritualized gatekeeping, sometimes performed well, sometimes missed. A patient with a dirty wound should have vaccination status assessed. If the person is incompletely vaccinated or status is unknown, and the wound is high risk, then passive protection with immune globulin is paired with active vaccination. This pairing matters. Immune globulin provides immediate antibodies. Vaccine teaches the body to make its own. One is borrowed money, one is income. When the system works, the emergency department does this automatically, like a reflex. When the system is overburdened, the checklist slips. The result is predictable. Preventable cases continue. The Forbidden Dispensary. This is where language gets dangerous, because language loves drama more than it loves accuracy. You've heard it. Maybe you've said it. Tetanus, the disease that breaks spines. It is a phrase built to survive. It has weight, it has bite, it makes the listener flinch, and flinching is how public health messages sometimes get traction. But history is full of phrases like this, half true, half theatrical, and fully capable of distorting what matters most. So let's handle it carefully. Tetanus is primarily a disease of muscle control, not because the muscles are infected, but because the nervous system is robbed of inhibition. The toxin cuts the brakes. The result is sustained contraction, rigid posture, and spasms powerful enough to look like the body is trying to tear itself apart. The spine, meanwhile, is caught in the middle. The paraspinal muscles, those long bands that keep you upright, can contract with frightening force. When the disease drives opisthotonos, the body can arch so severely that a patient may be supported by head and heels alone, the torso lifted like a bridge. That is where the phrase comes from, and sometimes, in rare cases, there is structural damage. Medical literature, especially in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, contains reports of fractures that occurred during severe, prolonged spasms. Compression fractures of thoracic vertebrae, rib fractures, occasional dislocations. Autopsy series and case reports from cities like London, Paris, and Berlin sometimes noted broken bone in the aftermath of violent rigidity. These cases were dramatic, they were publishable, they became cautionary tales passed from clinician to clinician, the way medicine passes along horrors in order to keep attention sharp. But here is the truth the phrase hides. Spinal fractures are not the typical defining feature of tetanus. They are plausible in terms of physics, especially in older patients with fragile bone, or in cases with prolonged, uncontrolled spasms. But they are not the rule. Most patients with tetanus do not suffer a literal snapped spine as the main event. The spine bends and groans under the muscle's insistence, and in some unlucky bodies, something fails. Rare, real, and not the core pathology. So why does the phrase persist? Because it compresses the disease into a single image. It makes prevention sound urgent. It makes the threat feel bodily and immediate. And in some eras, especially when public health needed blunt messaging, such phrases had utility, but they can also mislead. If you think tetanus is mainly about bone breaking, you may miss the real mechanics. Airway failure, autonomic instability, toxin binding inside nerves, the long recovery required for synaptic machinery to rebuild. The real danger is not that the spine snaps like a twig. The real danger is that breathing becomes impossible, that spasms trigger aspiration, that the nervous system becomes a trap. The spine phrase also feeds a certain kind of fatalistic awe, as if the disease is a monster of raw strength rather than a molecular sabotage. And tetanus is sabotage, a tiny protease cleaving a single component of neurotransmitter release, a quiet cut that produces loud suffering, a disease whose drama is downstream, not at the source. This mismatch between mechanism and metaphor matters historically because it shaped how people responded. When tetanus was framed as a violent external force, communities leaned into exorcism and moral interpretation. When it was framed as poison, they leaned into antidotes and cautery. When it was framed as contamination, they leaned into cleanliness and sterile technique. When it was framed as a vaccine-preventable toxin-mediated illness, they leaned, when systems allowed, into routine immunization. Metaphor, in other words, is policy fuel. But metaphor is also capable of turning the patient into a symbol instead of a person. The risus sardonicus face, the arched back, the rigid limbs, these were photographed, drawn, described, and circulated. Medical students learned from them. Reformers used them. Propagandists exploited them. The sardonic grin became a cultural artifact, almost detached from the human being underneath it. It showed up in writing as shorthand for a kind of cruel irony, a smile that accompanies death, laughter as mockery, suffering as spectacle. The ancient story about the Sardinian plant fed that symbolism. So did the fact that the disease so often preserved consciousness, creating the unbearable idea of a mind trapped behind a clenched jaw and rigid chest. In the 19th century, as medical photography grew, the images became tools. Sometimes they pushed change. Sometimes they created stigma. A disease that could have been treated as a preventable infection instead became, in some public imagination, a mark of dirtiness, backwardness, or neglect. That stigma was especially cruel in neonatal tetanus, where the social causes are structural: poverty, distance, lack of access to clean delivery supplies, the absence of maternal immunization. Yet the cultural story could frame the death as personal failure rather than systemic absence. So here is the correction the Forbidden Dispensary insists on: tetanus is not a punishment. It is not a moral diagnosis. It is not a spine-breaking monster. It is an environmental organism and a neurotoxin. It is a disease that thrives in gaps: gaps in skin, gaps in care, gaps in infrastructure. The spine-breaking phrase can be kept, if you must keep it, as a cautionary poem. But do not let it replace the real lesson. Prevention is the weapon, and prevention is mostly ordinary. Vaccination schedules that are maintained, boosters given, clean wound care, clean births, ready access to immune globulin for high-risk injuries, quiet rooms and ventilators for those who fall ill. Now the next part of the story is the broad map. Not the bedside, not the operating theatre, the world map. Because tetanus in the 21st century does not distribute itself randomly. It traces inequality with a steady finger. It shows you where cold chains fail, where women are not reached, where records do not exist, where conflict breaks health systems into fragments. Look at the map, not the microbe. The microbe is everywhere. The map is where the story becomes personal. Clostridium tetani lives in soil. It does not rely on human bodies to survive. It does not need crowds, airports, or coughing to move. It waits as a spore, durable, heat-tolerant, indifferent, until a wound offers it a low-oxygen pocket and time. That single ecological fact is why tetanus is not a candidate for true eradication in the way smallpox was, or in the way polio has been chased. You cannot vaccinate the earth. You can only vaccinate people, so the modern goal has never been to remove the organism from the planet. The goal is to remove easy victims from its reach, to make human bodies unprofitable territory. In countries with high vaccination coverage, reliable boosters, and consistent surgical hygiene, tetanus becomes rare enough that many clinicians never see a case in training. When it does appear, it often follows predictable contours. Older adults who never completed primary immunization, people whose immunity has waned because boosters were missed, individuals with limited healthcare access, or those with high-risk wounds and delayed care. But that is only one version of the world. The other version is where tetanus remains a marker of structural vulnerability. especially maternal and neonatal tetanus, which is not just a disease category, but an indictment. Global public health tried to put this indictment into measurable terms. The Maternal and Neonatal Tetanus Elimination Initiative established a practical definition of elimination. Not 0 cases everywhere, but incidents driven below a threshold in every district. The metric used in many places was fewer than 1 case of neonatal tetanus per 1,000 live births at the district level. It is an administrative definition, a bureaucratic line in the sand. And that line matters because it forces ministries and partners to look beyond national averages. A country can report excellent overall coverage while still hiding pockets of vulnerability. Remote districts, marginalized populations, conflict-affected zones, where newborns are still dying unseen. Tetanus lives in those pockets. A central problem in tracking tetanus is that surveillance is hard even in functional systems. The disease is diagnosed clinically. Laboratory confirmation is uncommon and often not practical. Many cases, especially neonatal, occur outside health facilities. The baby dies at home, and no formal death certificate is issued, or the cause is recorded as fever or seizures or unknown. So planners rely on imperfect tools. They use reported vaccination coverage. They use data on skilled birth attendants. They use antenatal care visit rates. They use supply chain records showing how many doses were shipped and used. They conduct validation surveys, going household to household to see whether administrative numbers match lived reality. And often they find gaps. Administrative coverage can look clean because it is arithmetic. Doses given divided by target population. But the target population is often an estimate, and estimates can be wrong. Overestimation can make coverage look low. Underestimation can make it look unrealistically high. Records can be inflated under pressure. Dose counts can be misreported. In some systems, clinics are rewarded for high coverage and punished for low, creating incentives for numbers to drift. The result is a kind of fog. Tetanus thrives in fog. Cold chain is the second invisible constraint that shapes the map. Tetanus toxoid is more forgiving than some other vaccines, but it still requires temperature control for reliable potency. Keeping vaccines within proper temperature, ranges from factory to rural clinic, requires functioning refrigerators, fuel or reliable electricity, trained staff, transport schedules, and monitoring. Small innovations have mattered enormously here. Vaccine vial monitors, those tiny heat exposure indicators, help prevent the use of compromised doses in remote settings. Solar-powered refrigerators help in places where grid electricity is unreliable. Better cold boxes and temperature loggers reduce waste and failure. But the last mile remains a fight with heat, distance, rain, and breakdown. When the cold chain breaks, a vaccine can become a ritual without reliable protection. The injection happens, the record is marked, but immunity is not guaranteed. That is a quiet failure, and one of the reasons elimination can be declared in a policy document while cases still emerge in the shadows. Conflict is a third mapmaker. War and instability do not just injure people. They dissolve systems. Clinics close, roads become unsafe, health workers flee, refrigerators fail, records vanish. Women give birth in displacement without clean supplies. Campaigns cannot reach them. Surveillance collapses, so cases go uncounted. Tetanus does not spread person to person, but conflict multiplies wounds and reduces prevention at the same time. It creates a perfect storm: increased risk, decreased protection, decreased detection. And there is a quieter form of conflict that also matters: distrust. In some regions, vaccination efforts have been entangled with politics, rumor, and fear. Health workers can be perceived as agents of the state or of outside powers. Communities with long histories of exploitation do not always welcome a program delivered with urgency and little listening. Where public health approached communities with humility, working with local leaders, training and supporting traditional birth attendants, respecting household dynamics, uptake improved. Where it approached with scolding or coercion, resistance hardened. and the last vulnerable groups stayed vulnerable. Gender is stitched through this map like a seam. Maternal immunization depends on women's access to antenatal care. Antenatal care depends on distance, cost, education, and autonomy. In many settings, women need permission to travel. They need money for transport. They need to believe the clinic will treat them with respect. They need to survive pregnancy long enough to make it to a visit. In short, immunization is not only a medical act, it is a social permission. That is why maternal and neonatal tetanus is often clustered where women are most marginalized. The disease becomes a proxy for gender inequality. One of the harder truths is that tetanus elimination efforts have succeeded most visibly where broader improvements occurred at the same time. More facility births, more skilled attendants, better transport, stronger routine immunization, better education. Vaccines mattered, but vaccines traveled on the back of system strengthening. Where those broader improvements did not occur, campaigns could reduce cases temporarily, but the risk returned when campaigns ended. Because tetanus is patient, it does not need an outbreak to survive. It only needs neglect to persist. This is also why the remaining burden in some wealthier countries often concentrates in older adults. Immunity wanes. Boosters are missed. People assume childhood shots last forever. They do not. A garden injury, a puncture wound, a fall on dirty metal, these can still open the door. In those settings, tetanus becomes the disease of the immunologically forgotten. Not always the poor, but often the isolated. Older adults, people without regular primary care, those who do not engage with preventative medicine unless illness forces it. So the geography of tetanus is not simply rich versus poor, it is connected versus unconnected, tracked versus untracked, served versus missed. And this leads to the uncomfortable question public health hates to answer out loud. When a disease is preventable, how much suffering is tolerated before the system changes? Tetanus control is not limited by scientific knowledge. The toxin is understood. The vaccine is proven. The wound protocols are established. The failure points are implementation and equity. Which brings us to culture, because culture decides what is tolerated, what is prioritized, what is remembered, and what is allowed to fade. The Forbidden Dispensary. This chapter is about what happens when a disease escapes medicine and enters imagination. When symptoms become metaphor. When a person's face becomes a tool. Tetanus has always had a visual signature, and the human mind clings to signatures. The locked jaw, the arched back, the clenched hands, the spasms triggered by a sound, and above all, the face, pulled into that expression medicine calls risus sardonicus, the sardonic smile. It is an expression that reads like mockery even when the person is suffering. That is why it sticks. The body seems to be laughing while dying. It feels obscene, and obscenity is memorable. Long before bacteriology gave the grin a mechanism, language gave it a story. The Sardinian thread, Pliny's tale of a plant that caused death laughter, lingered in Western memory and fed the word sardonic itself. The etymology became a little ghost that haunted clinical description. Doctors used the term because it was useful. Writers used it because it was rich. The public absorbed it because it was horrifying. By the 19th century, as hospitals became places of documentation and medical education grew more formal, tetanus became a subject of illustration. Drawings, lithographs, later photography. A patient's rigidity became an image that could travel. This was a double-edged progress. For students, images taught recognition. A young physician who had never seen tetanus could learn the signs. That knowledge could save lives, but the same image could also turn suffering into spectacle. Clinical photography is often defended as necessary education, and sometimes it is, but it has always carried the risk of stripping the subject of privacy and dignity. In tetanus, that risk was amplified by the sheer drama of the posture. An arched body looks almost staged. A clenched face looks almost theatrical. The camera loved it, and the camera, as always, is indifferent to consent. Public health campaigns also discovered the power of the image. Fear persuades quickly. In communities where neonatal tetanus was killing infants, posters and pamphlets sometimes used photographs or drawings of stiffened babies to drive home the message: clean blade, clean cord, vaccination. Sometimes it worked. Fear can be an accelerant, but fear also burns trust. If a campaign relies on horror, it can create shame, and shame is poison for prevention. A mother who fears being judged may hide a home birth, may avoid a clinic, may refuse to speak openly about cord care practices. A family who feels accused may become defensive and cling tighter to tradition. Stigma can make the very behavior you want to change more secretive. This matters because neonatal tetanus has often been entangled with moral storytelling. The death of a newborn is already soaked in grief and guilt. Communities sometimes interpret such deaths through spiritual frameworks: fate, curses, ancestral displeasure, malevolent spirits. Those explanations may not align with bacteriology, but they are not random. They are attempts to impose meaning on unbearable loss. Public health workers who dismissed those beliefs as stupidity often failed. The communities did not suddenly become more rational. They became more resistant. The successful programs learned a hard lesson. You do not replace belief by ridicule. You replace it by relationship. You work with local leaders. You train and support traditional birth attendants rather than treating them as enemies. You respect the social structures governing who can speak to women, who can enter homes, who can make decisions. You offer clean delivery kits as tangible alternatives, not lectures. You frame vaccination and clean cord care as protection, not correction. Where that humility existed, practice shifted. Where it did not, programs became another chapter in a long history of outsiders, arriving with authority and leaving behind resentment. Colonial history adds another layer of rot to this story. In colonial medical writing, high neonatal mortality was often presented as evidence of backwardness. Traditional cord care practices were described in disgust, stripped of cultural context, and used to justify paternalistic intervention. The implication was not merely that the practice was risky, but that the people themselves were defective. That framing did real damage. It turned medical outreach into a political weapon, and communities learned to associate health education with humiliation. Even when the biomedical critique was correct, some cord applications were indeed dangerous. The moral posture behind the critique created resistance. The result was a paradox. Interventions that could have saved lives were rejected because they arrived wrapped in contempt. Tetanus metaphors also leaked into politics and literature in ways that shaped public understanding. Writers used Lockjaw as shorthand for a grim, old-fashioned death. Politicians used stiffness and broken spine as metaphors for social paralysis or the crushing of opposition. The sardonic smile became a symbol of cruel irony, of laughter in the face of suffering. This symbolic life of tetanus helped keep it in public awareness, but it also risked turning the disease into a rhetorical toy rather than a concrete preventable event. Meanwhile, in wealthy settings, as vaccination pushed tetanus out of everyday experience, the cultural memory faded. When a disease becomes rare, people stop fearing it. When they stop fearing it, they stop making room for prevention. Boosters get missed, risk is underestimated, so tetanus developed a strange dual identity in the modern era. In some places, it became a forgotten horror, something older physicians remember and younger ones read about. In other places, it remained present but hidden, occurring in homes, not hospitals, living in the shadows of incomplete records. Culture influences which version is visible. A society that treats neonatal death as unremarkable tragedy will not generate the political pressure needed to fund cold chain upgrades and midwife training. A society that treats women's health as optional will not build robust antenatal services. A society that uses shame instead of support will drive risky practices underground. So the cultural chapter of tetanus is not decorative, it is operational. It decides whether a vaccine campaign is welcomed or resisted. It decides whether a mother feels safe seeking care. It decides whether the last mile is walked. Now we move into the final stretch of the story. What the long history of tetanus teaches about prevention as a system, not a slogan. What must be maintained, what fails when attention drifts, what the future could look like if we stop treating vaccination as an occasional emergency and keep treating it as civic infrastructure. By now you can feel the pattern. Tetanus is not defeated by genius alone. It is defeated by maintenance. The kind of maintenance that never makes headlines and still decides who lives. The modern world already owns the core tools. The toxin is understood. The toxoid vaccine works. Wound prophylaxis protocols are clear. Clean delivery practices are teachable and cheap compared to intensive care. None of this is mystery anymore. So when tetanus persists, it persists for reasons that are almost embarrassingly ordinary. A refrigerator fails. A shipment arrives late. A clinic runs out of syringes. A woman cannot afford transport to antenatal care. A birth happens at home because the facility is far, the staff are harsh, or the fees are impossible. A data clerk is unpaid and stops reporting. A war breaks a road into a checkpoint. A rumor outruns a nurse. That is the architecture of prevention when it collapses. Not one dramatic crack, but many small fractures that add up to an open door. In wealthy health systems, prevention often fails in a different way. Not through collapse, but through forgetting. Tetanus immunity wanes. Boosters matter. Adults who assume childhood vaccination lasts forever are walking around with a shield that has thinned. When primary care is fragmented, when preventative visits are rare, when patients do not have a consistent clinician tracking immunization status, boosters slip. So tetanus becomes the disease of the immunologically neglected. Not necessarily the poorest, but the least connected to routine care. That is why effective tetanus control requires integration. It cannot be treated as a vaccine program that runs on the side. It must be stitched into multiple points of contact. Childhood immunization schedules, school entry requirements, routine adult primary care visits, occupational health in high-risk industries, emergency wound care protocols, antenatal care for pregnant women, postpartum follow-up, and it must be tracked, not in the abstract, but with real data that can identify who is being missed. This is where public health stops being messaging and becomes engineering. If a district reports high maternal immunization coverage but still sees neonatal tetanus, the system must treat that as an alarm. It could mean cold chain failure. It could mean inaccurate coverage reporting. It could mean a marginalized group is being missed. Women delivering outside facilities, women in informal settlements, women in remote areas. Surveillance must be sensitive enough to detect those pockets. And sensitive surveillance requires investment in civil registration and vital statistics systems. The unglamorous infrastructure of counting births and deaths accurately. Without that, neonatal tetanus can hide forever as unknown neonatal seizure illness, or fever, or simply died at home. The next layer is research, because even proven tools can be improved. A toxoid schedule that requires multiple doses and periodic boosters is vulnerable to missed visits. The fewer doses required, the more robust the system becomes in difficult settings. Vaccines that tolerate heat better reduce dependence on perfect cold chain. Thermostable formulations are a practical holy grail for remote delivery. Operational research also matters, not laboratory glamour but field truth. Which outreach strategies reliably reach women of reproductive age? What combination of community engagement and service delivery changes cord care practices without stigma? How can immunization be integrated into antenatal care so that every visit becomes a vaccination opportunity? Which reminder systems work in low-resource settings? Paper cards, text messages, community health worker tracking, village registers. What incentives help retain trained midwives in rural districts? Prevention is as much social design as it is pharmacology, and then there is the ethics of the last mile. When overall national incidence falls, leaders become tempted to declare victory and move funding elsewhere. The remaining cases are fewer, and fewer cases are easier to ignore. But the remaining cases are not random. They cluster in the least protected groups. So the final stage of elimination is always an equity test. Do we keep funding campaigns for the last districts? Do we negotiate access in conflict zones? Do we pay community health workers enough to stay? Do we maintain refrigerators and fuel supplies even when the political spotlight is elsewhere? Do we treat a newborn death as a national shame or as private sorrow? Tetanus control asks these questions relentlessly because it does not go away on its own. Now we are approaching the end of this long narration, but there is one more essential truth to speak plainly. Tetanus teaches that prevention is cumulative. A single vaccine dose helps. A completed series helps more. Boosters sustain that protection. Clean delivery kits reduce exposure. Skilled birth attendants reduces risk further. Reliable wound care protocols catch injuries before toxin gets ahead. And intensive care capacity, where it exists, turns severe disease from near certain death into survivable ordeal. None of these alone is sufficient everywhere. Together they create a barrier high enough that the organism can remain in the soil without finding many human bodies to inhabit. The Forbidden Dispensary. We are near the end now, where the story becomes almost disappointing if you wanted drama. Because the real ending, when it goes well, is silence. The ancient physicians gave tetanus its first hard outlines. They didn't know spores, they didn't know toxins, but they knew the jaw that would not open, the neck that would not bend, the body pulled backward into a posture so violent it looked like punishment. They wrote what they saw, and what they saw was consistent enough that the description survived centuries. The medieval world inherited those descriptions and tried to meet them with what it had. Honey and wine and vinegar, cautery and bandages, prayer and relics. The mixture of ritual and remedy was not stupidity. It was triage in an era with limited tools. When a body convulsed, communities threw every available language at it. Physical, spiritual, moral, because the cost of doing nothing was too obvious. Then the early modern period sharpened observation into method. Physicians began to classify disease not only by theory but by pattern. Case notes accumulated. Hospitals became places where repetition could be counted. Surgeons recorded outcomes. Military medicine wrote ledgers because war turns bodies into statistics, whether you like it or not. That accumulation mattered more than it gets credit for. It turned isolated tragedies into a recognizable phenomenon tied to wounds, to soil, to certain environments, to childbirth practices, to the hidden dangers of devitalized tissue. And then the bench lamps came on. In the year 1884, Nicolea saw the rods and spores in wound material and soil. A hint, a pointing finger. In the year 1889, Kitasato cultivated the organism under anaerobic conditions and demonstrated that sterile filtrate could reproduce the disease. The bacterium did not need to march into the brain. It only needed to leave behind a soluble poison. That one idea, tetanus as toxin-mediated sabotage, changed everything. It explained why consciousness could remain intact. It explained why the central nervous system often showed little visible inflammation at autopsy, despite the ferocity of symptoms. It explained why timing mattered so cruelly. Once the toxin entered nerves, serum could not drag it back. The antitoxin era followed, born in laboratories, raised in stables. Horses became living factories of immunity. Serum could save lives when given early, but it demanded cold chain, potencies, supply lines, and accepted risk. Serum sickness and allergic reactions were the price of borrowing protection across species. Then came the larger, calmer revolution, toxoid. In the decade of the 1920s, tetanus toxin was chemically tamed into a form that could teach immunity without causing disease. Adjuvants amplified protection. Vaccination turned the disease from a fate into a probability, one that could be driven down with routine. War then enforced scale. Armies made immunization policy when it proved its value. After war, civilian systems borrowed the machinery. Childhood schedules standardized. Combination vaccines made compliance easier. School entry rules turned vaccination from personal choice into social expectation. Surgery, meanwhile, learned to stop offering tetanus an invitation. Semmelweis insisted on hand-washing and was punished for it. Lister fogged theaters with carbolic and changed the argument. Asepsis followed. Autoclaves, gloves, masks, sterile technique, until the operating room became less like a stage and more like controlled engineering. Debridement became doctrine, not because it was elegant, but because it removed the anaerobic darkness where Clostridia thrive. This is what the long arc really is. Not one discovery, but a stack of disciplines. Observation, classification, laboratory proof, industrial production, supply chains, protocol, training, trust, maintenance. And in the late 20th century, the story widened again into global elimination efforts targeting maternal and neonatal tetanus. The goal was not to sterilize the soil, it was to stop babies from dying because their mothers were unreachable by routine services. In the year 1989, the Elimination Initiative formalized the truth. The disease had been repeating for centuries. Prevention must reach women where they live, and clean birth practices must be realistic, not aspirational. Vaccinate women of reproductive age, improve antenatal care, promote clean cord care, train and support the birth attendants who are actually present, maintain cold chain, count births and deaths, find the last districts where cases still occur and do the tiring work of reaching them. This is where tetanus teaches the same lesson again and again. Science is not the bottleneck. Equity is. When the system works, tetanus becomes rare enough that it is almost mythic. A disease older doctors recall with a grim look. A word younger clinicians know mostly from textbooks, but when the system fails, through conflict, poverty, marginalization, neglect, tetanus does not need to return. It was always there, it simply finds a body again. And now the final irony. When prevention succeeds, it produces nothing visible. No dramatic cure. No hero moment with a last-minute antidote. Just babies who do not die. Workers who step on nails and are protected. Soldiers who survive wounds without the delayed sentence of Lockjaw. Operating rooms where sterile technique prevents infections nobody ever has to name. A refrigerator humming in a rural clinic. A vaccine vial kept at the right temperature. A health worker filling out a record. A midwife insisting on a clean blade. The victory looks like nothing happening. It looks like the absence of a scream. Last door. After this, the corridor goes quiet again. Tetanus has always been a disease that punishes small neglects with oversized consequence. That is its ancient talent. It does not announce itself with a plague bell. It does not sweep through crowds the way measles does. It arrives like a private message delivered through a tiny wound, and then it turns the body into a locked room. The oldest writers described it the only way they could, by posture and expression. A jaw that would not open, a neck that would not bow, a back pulled into a bow so tight it looked like the body was trying to flee itself. They did not know why the mind stayed awake. They only knew the horror of it, and they wrote down what they saw because writing is what people do when they cannot stop something any other way. Later, others built explanations out of whatever their era allowed. Humors, winds, curses, poison, demons. Some of those explanations were wrong in mechanism, but the impulse behind them was consistent. Humans cannot tolerate meaningless suffering, so we clothe it in cause. Even the wrong cause is a form of relief. Then the relief became more practical, one small invention at a time. Someone noticed that honey and wine helped wounds behave better. Someone noticed that dirt and crushed tissue were dangerous. Someone learned that heat could stop rot, even if it also harmed. Someone built a rule book for cleaning, for dressing, for closing. Someone built a guild so not every hand could cut. Someone made an autoclave and forced steel to become clean by law, not by hope. Someone looked into a microscope and saw a shape that matched the story. Someone found that the shape lived in soil and hated air. Someone grew it in darkness and proved the disease could be carried not only by the organism, but by what it left behind. And then came the most unsettling discovery of all. The violence was not a storm, it was a cut. A molecular blade, specific and quiet, severing the machinery that lets inhibitory neurons release their calming signals. Not a breaking of bones as the central act, but a breaking of restraint. The body's own reflexes turned loose, ungoverned, and strong enough to make the world fear a phrase about snapped spines. Antitoxin followed, first borrowed from horses, distributed like a precious commodity, sometimes saving lives, sometimes arriving too late, sometimes punishing the recipient with its own immune consequences. It was rescue, but it was never clean rescue. It was a bargain signed under pressure. Then toxoid, poison tamed into lesson, the immune system taught before the wound ever happened. A preventative act that required no hero at the bedside, only a functioning schedule, and someone willing to show up on the day the shot was due. That is where the story's moral stops being poetic and becomes almost irritating in its practicality. Tetanus is defeated by systems that do not get tired. A clinic that keeps vaccines cold. A nurse who keeps records straight. A community health worker who walks the last mile even when the last mile is dust and rain. A midwife who insists on a clean blade and a dry cord stump, not as an insult to tradition, but as a gift to survival. An emergency department that checks immunization status and does not let a dirty puncture wound become a gamble. A surgeon who debrides devitalized tissue with the calm knowledge that oxygen is an ally and darkness is an invitation. And a public that remembers, faintly but enough, what the disease used to look like when nobody had those systems. Because the strangest part of prevention is that it works best when it becomes invisible. When a society is protected, it starts to forget why it built the protection. The memory fades, the boosters slip, the budget lines move elsewhere, the refrigerator breaks and stays broken, the outreach program loses fuel, the midwife loses supplies, the ledger stops being updated, the last districts become easy to ignore because the national average looks clean. And that is when tetanus does what it has always done. It waits. It does not need anger. It does not need evolution. It does not need a new variant. It only needs a gap. That is why the final lesson of tetanus is not about fear. Fear is loud and temporary. The lesson is about maintenance, the steady, dull, life-saving labor that keeps prevention real. If you want to understand the history in one image, do not picture the arched patient or the sardonic grin, though those images earned their place in the record. Picture instead a small refrigerator in a rural clinic that keeps running through a hot afternoon. Picture a vial of toxoid kept cold because someone remembered to check the temperature. Picture a woman receiving a vaccine dose during pregnancy and thinking only about getting home before dark, unaware that the antibodies forming in her blood will be handed to her child before the child ever takes a breath. Picture a newborn who feeds normally and keeps feeding, and no one calls it a miracle because the absence of tetanus does not make noise. That is the ending tetanus respects. Not myth, not heroics, not a single dramatic cure. Just a world made slightly less hospitable to an ancient patient spore. This has been the Forbidden Dispensary. Close the door softly on your way out. The story will still be here if you ever need to remember why ordinary prevention is one of the most powerful things humans have ever built.